Writing. The woman was standing in the middle of a snow-covered road with one hand wrapped around an old suitcase and the other resting protectively over her pregnant belly when the German Shepherd suddenly stopped in front of her. For several seconds, the dog stared at her as if he had recognized something no human could see. Behind the wooden fence, a man in a dark winter jacket lowered the piece of firewood he was carrying and watched silently. The woman looked exhausted, pale, and completely lost. She had no coat warm enough for the freezing morning, no car, and nowhere to go. Then the dog pulled free from the man's side and walked directly toward her. What happened next would change 3 lives forever. Before we begin, if you believe that kindness can give someone a second chance when the whole world has already given up on them, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Legacy. Sometimes one small act of kindness becomes the reason someone finds the strength to keep going. Her name was Mara Voss, and at 29 years old, she had learned how quickly a person could become invisible. Only 3 months earlier, she had been living in a warm apartment in the city, working at a small medical supply company and preparing for the arrival of her first child. She had spent years believing that if she worked hard, stayed honest, and treated people well, life would eventually return the favor. Then her fiancé left. Not gradually, not kindly, but in one cold conversation after telling her that he was no longer interested in becoming a father. He emptied their joint account, moved out while she was at work, and left her with unpaid bills, a growing pregnancy, and an apartment she could no longer afford. Mara tried to keep working, but complications with the pregnancy forced her to reduce her hours. Within weeks, she lost her job. She sold her jewelry first, then her television, then almost everything that had belonged to her. The final blow came when her landlord gave her 48 hours to leave. Mara had called relatives, old friends, and every shelter she could find, but every door seemed to close before she could reach it. One distant acquaintance offered her a temporary room in a rural town, but the message came with a warning that the room would not be available until the following week. Mara had nowhere to spend the days in between. So she boarded a morning bus with the last of her money, carrying an old suitcase and a small envelope containing her medical records. She had no idea that the bus route would be interrupted by a snowstorm. When the driver finally stopped at a tiny roadside station, Mara stepped off because she believed she could walk to the nearby town. She was wrong. The snow was deeper than she expected, the wind cut through her clothes, and her phone battery died after she tried calling for help. By late morning, she was barely able to feel her fingers. That was when she saw the wooden fence. Behind it stood a modest farmhouse surrounded by snow-covered fields. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth she desperately needed. Mara hesitated. She hated asking strangers for anything. But her stomach tightened, and the baby moved beneath her hand. She whispered a desperate prayer, picked up her suitcase, and started toward the property. The man behind the fence was named Ronan Hale, a former Navy SEAL who had spent years learning how to survive situations that would have broken most people. He was 38, broad-shouldered, quiet, and carried himself with the controlled stillness of someone who had witnessed too much violence to waste words. After leaving the military, Ronan had purchased the farmhouse with his savings and devoted himself to raising rescue dogs and rebuilding his life away from crowds. His German Shepherd, Atlas, was the closest thing he had to family. Atlas was normally obedient. He never crossed a boundary without Ronan's permission. But when he saw Mara, something changed. He walked straight to the gate, lowered his head, and began whining. Ronan noticed the woman's condition immediately. Her lips were pale. Her fingers trembled. Snow had collected in her hair and on her shoulders. But what concerned him most was the way she kept protecting her stomach. He opened the gate. Mara immediately apologized for trespassing and tried to explain that she only needed somewhere to sit for a few minutes. She promised she would leave as soon as she could walk again. Ronan did not ask for her entire story. He simply looked at Atlas, then at the woman, and told her she needed to come inside. Mara shook her head at first. Fear had taught her not to trust strangers. Ronan seemed to understand that. He stepped backward, leaving the gate open, giving her enough space to choose. Atlas made the decision for her. The dog gently pressed his head against Mara's hand. She began crying.
Not loud crying. Not dramatic crying.
Just the quiet kind that happens when someone has been strong for too long and finally realizes they are safe enough to stop pretending. Inside the farmhouse, Ronan gave her a blanket, warm water, soup, and a chair beside the wood stove. Mara sat there shaking while Atlas lay at her feet. Ronan called a local clinic and explained that a pregnant woman had been exposed to severe cold. The nurse told him to bring her in immediately. After the examination, the doctor assured Mara that the baby appeared stable, but warned her that she needed warmth, rest, food, and regular medical care. Mara lowered her eyes and admitted that she had nowhere to stay. Ronan listened without interrupting. Then he offered her the small guest room at his farmhouse. Mara stared at him as if she had misunderstood. She asked what he expected in return.
Ronan simply said nothing. That silence frightened her more than any demand could have. She had spent months being treated as a problem, a burden, or an inconvenience. She could not understand why a complete stranger would help her without asking for something in return.
That evening, while Ronan prepared dinner, Mara sat near the window watching the daylight disappear over the frozen fields. Atlas remained beside her. She noticed the dog constantly looking toward Ronan and then back at her. With a tired smile, she asked the question that had been haunting her since she arrived. She wondered what Ronan thought was wrong with her. Why did he keep watching her like he expected her to collapse? Ronan looked at Atlas, smiled faintly, and answered that the dog seemed to think she simply needed somewhere warm. Those words broke something open inside Mara. She turned toward the window so Ronan would not see her crying. Because nobody had said anything that gentle to her in months. The next several days passed quietly. Ronan never treated Mara like a helpless woman. He fixed the loose wheel on her suitcase, cleared the snowy path outside, drove her to medical appointments, and left food outside her door when he noticed she needed sleep. He never invaded her privacy. He never demanded gratitude. Mara began helping around the farmhouse when she felt strong enough. She cooked simple meals, folded laundry, and eventually started brushing Atlas every morning. The dog followed her everywhere. But beneath the peaceful routine was a secret Mara had not told Ronan. She was planning to leave. She had received a message from her former fiancé. He wanted her to sign papers giving up any future claim to his property and promised that once she signed, he would send enough money to cover her medical expenses. Mara knew it was manipulative, but she felt trapped. She believed accepting Ronan's kindness for too long would make her a burden. One bright winter afternoon, while Ronan was repairing a fence, Mara packed her suitcase. She wrote a short note thanking him and walked outside. Atlas immediately noticed. The dog stood in the doorway, staring at her. Mara knelt and hugged him tightly. She whispered that she was sorry, then stood up with tears filling her eyes. She had only taken a few steps when Ronan appeared at the end of the path. He did not shout. He did not accuse her. He simply asked where she planned to go. Mara finally told him everything. She confessed that she had been afraid of becoming another responsibility for someone. She admitted that she had spent so long being abandoned that she no longer believed kindness could exist without a price. Ronan looked at her suitcase, then at the snow-covered road. He told her that surviving alone was not the same as living alone. Mara began crying again. Ronan explained that during his military years, he had learned something that had stayed with him after every deployment. A person could survive terrible conditions if they knew someone was coming for them. The hardest part was not the cold, the hunger, or the fear. It was believing that nobody cared whether you made it through. Mara looked down at her stomach. For the first time, she realized she had been carrying more than a baby. She had been carrying shame, fear, rejection, and the belief that she was no longer worthy of being cared for. Ronan gently took the suitcase from her hand and carried it back toward the farmhouse. Atlas followed happily behind them. Weeks passed, and winter slowly began giving way to spring. Mara's pregnancy progressed safely. She found part-time remote work helping a medical supplier with inventory records, and Ronan helped her create a budget so she could eventually move into her own small home. He never tried to replace the father of her child. He simply became the person who reminded her that family could sometimes begin with a stranger opening a door.
One warm April morning, Mara woke with sharp pain. She knew immediately. The baby was coming.
Ronan drove her through the early morning light while Atlas stayed with a neighbor. At the hospital, Mara gripped Ronan's hand as the hours passed. She was terrified, exhausted, and overwhelmed. Then, just after sunrise, her daughter was born. Mara held the tiny baby against her chest and began sobbing.
Ronan stood near the doorway, tears quietly running down his face.
Mara looked at him and said that she had never imagined her daughter would enter the world surrounded by kindness. Ronan smiled and told her that the baby had already been surrounded by it for months.
The little girl's name was Ilara. Months later, on a bright summer morning, Mara stood outside the farmhouse watching Ilara take her first uncertain steps across the grass. Atlas followed carefully beside her.
Ronan sat on the porch, pretending not to be nervous.
Mara had eventually moved into her own little house nearby.
She had rebuilt her career, regained her confidence, and learned that needing help did not make her weak.
Every Sunday, she and Ilara visited Ronan. Not because she owed him anything. Not because he had rescued her.
They came because somewhere between a frozen road, a frightened woman, and a German shepherd who refused to let her walk away, 3 lonely hearts had found a reason to belong. And sometimes Mara still remembered that terrible winter morning. She remembered the suitcase in her hand. The snow on her shoulders. The fear inside her chest. And most of all, she remembered the words that changed everything. "He says you need somewhere warm." Years later, Mara would tell Ilara that kindness does not always arrive wearing a cape. Sometimes it arrives carrying firewood.
Sometimes it has 4 legs and a wet nose. Sometimes it is a quiet stranger who opens a gate and asks for nothing in return.
And sometimes, when life convinces you that you have nowhere left to go, kindness simply gives you a warm room until you remember how to find your way home. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who may need hope, and subscribe to Kindness Legacy. Your support helps these stories reach people who might need a little reminder that the world still has good people in it. And before we end, here is a special request. Comment, "There is always a warm place for kindness," if you believe one small act of compassion can change an entire life.
Because Mara never forgot the day she thought she was completely alone.
She only discovered that she had been wrong. Somewhere behind a wooden gate, a man was waiting with a warm house. Somewhere beside him, a loyal dog was waiting with an open heart. And somewhere inside Mara, a frightened woman was waiting to learn that being broken did not mean being beyond saving.